So when we talk about avian influenza virus, they are type A type of virus, and they are subdivided in two groups. And these groups are related to the capability of the virus to produce mortality in chickens and the laboratory condition. So these two type of viruses will be denominated as low pathogenic avian influenza virus and highly pathogenic influenza virus. We go here in this part of the graph. So for both type of viruses, there are more low pathogenics and very few high pathogenic type of strains. But the wild aquatic birds are the natural reservoir, and in these animals, the disease is completely asymptomatic. The virus is shed in saliva, nasal secretions, and feces in these animals. But when we move into the other part of the graph, when we go into the poultry, we need to take into consideration this virus very well, because there is an important potential for low pathogenic type of viruses to evolve to high pathogenic viruses, and those are the H5 and H7 specifically. With that evolution, there is an important potential for rapid spread and significant illness of the disease, causing a lot of mortality in poultry. With that, we could have an important economic impact and trade restriction, and then, of course, the possibility of these high pathogenic avian influenza virus to transmit to humans or pigs. So more indeed into the high pathogenic type of strains, we know that they are lethal in poultry. They create very severe disease, and they are very acute. They had a very sudden onset. They're very highly contagious, and they produce a very impressive disease just right after the beginning of the onset. And what you see in those birds is completely internal hemorrhaging syndrome. The virus spreads systemic, and it's pretty acute, and you can see mortality is approaching the 100% in all these in these facilities. Similar to what Dr. Cardona showed this morning, this is the outbreak that we suffered here in the United States starting last year and during the last spring. The first outbreak was detected in a backyard production back in December of 2014 in the state of Oregon. And then, here is the beginning of the epidemic curve. And then the first outbreak that we had here in Minnesota was in March of 2015, and that was already a commercial bird facility. With that, the whole epidemic curve has been reported in 21 states. 15 of them had domestic birds, and only 6 of them were detected only with wild birds. So this is the picture, the map that you can download at the USDA website. 223 outbreaks reported, more than 48 million, so birds were depopulated. And what is described is that the outbreaks, they follow 2 main pathways or flyways, the Pacific Flyway here, and the most important one was the Central or Mississippi Flyway. And within this second flyway, this other flyway, the states of Minnesota and Iowa were the more severe affected. Minnesota with 105 cases, and Iowa with 75 cases. So due to the field observation, specifically in the state of Minnesota during April, the airborne spread was suggested. So as part of my PhD training, we know that airborne viruses travel associated with particles of different sizes and composition, and that's what we found in a poultry facility. Many particles, many types of particles, different composition, and they belong from, they're coming from respiratory secretion, fecal material, the bedding that you can see in those facilities, feed, dust, etc. So why we're so focused on particle size of this type of airborne viruses? And that's because particle size determines the time that the virus will stay suspended in the air. It will also, with that, determine the distance that the virus could travel between farms. Within the host, once these particles are inhaled, it will determine the place that these particles will be deposited, in the upper respiratory level or even deeper if they are smaller particles. The particle size will also determine survivability and infectivity of the virus. And once we know this type of information, we can approach different biosecurity methods that are based on particle size, for example, air filtration. So our group, we had quite a bit of experience at working with this type of airborne pathogens in swine. We did quite a bit of work with birds, influenza, and PED virus. So for that reason, the USA approaches us to assist in this type of airborne transmission investigation in the field. So as a swine group, we wanted to know, okay, well, what do we know about high pathogenic type of virus in swine? So there is a lot of experience in influenza viruses in our group, and we know that pigs are susceptible for intranasal infections with both mammalian and avian type of viruses. Pigs are considered the mixing vessels of this type of viruses, and they create they are sometimes the cause of emerging of novel reassortment viruses. If we go back to the literature, there is the infection of H1N1 and highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 infection demonstrated under experimental conditions. But those pigs and those very few studies had no clinical signs, and they had no virus in the nasal swabs. So for us, it was kind of a flag, because that's the way we kind of do surveillance for influenza. So it will be the use of nasal swabs will be very limited in this type of findings if we see these highly pathogenic influenza viruses in pigs. So we hypothesized that the risk that pigs in swine dense areas surrounded by poultry operations, they are at risk of exposure for this swine virus. So with that, we did design a project that we wanted to evaluate the potential for airborne transmission of highly pathogenic avian influenza virus, and we did that in turkey and layer flocks. We wanted to detect and assess viability of this highly pathogenic avian influenza in our air samples. We wanted to assess particle size deposition of these viruses on surfaces surrounding the farms, and we wanted to study the particle distribution of these viruses in the air. So we got approached by the USDA, and we every morning that there was a new outbreak, we decided to go to those and we got ready. We went to those farms, and we went to 3 turkey flocks in Minnesota and 3 layer flocks in Iowa and Nebraska. We got to those farms within 3 to 10 days when the outbreaks was diagnosed and confirmed in those farms. And we found when we got there mortalities ranging between 5 and 80%. So in one farm we got there and we already saw most of the birds being disposed, and that was a very different scenario. For the air sampling procedures, we took samples from the inside of those facilities and the outside. And we took samples from the outside at different distances. We went immediately outside of the exhaust fans, then we moved up to 70 to 150 meters, and then we went far away up to 1 kilometer from those facilities. We took air samples with different devices. We worked with an air cyclonic type of device, and we worked with 2 air samplers that were able to separate particles by size. We work with an Anderson Cascade Impactor and with a high volume type of Cascade Impactor that I will show pictures in a moment. And then we also work with optical particle counters to demonstrate the amount of particles in the air with regards to the amount of viruses. So these are the air samplers that we use. Here we have the Anderson Cascade Impactor. Here I wanted to show the different airflows that these air devices work with. So 200 to 400 liters for the air cyclonic. Then these are the size selective type of air sampler. This is the Anderson Cascade Impactor that works with 20.3 liters per minute. Is able to separate particles in 8 sizes. And the Tish Cascade Impactor is a high volume type of sampler. These are no birds. But I just want to demonstrate the size, so pretty high, like high this side air sampler, and it has, it's pretty powerful. It has their own motor here. This sampler works with a pump, and this air sampler has its own motor as well. So very different techniques. We wanted to approach the farms with all the tools that we had available. So For the Andersen Cascade Impactor, it separates, just quick to explain a little bit this device, the airflow of this device goes that way. It has 8 stages and a backup filter, and each of the stages have holes of different sizes, so it is called Cascade because the air will go through the different stages, and if particles are small enough, they will be able to go to the next stage and the next stage through these holes, and they will remain in the plates if they are big enough, so they cannot go to the next stage. So these are the aluminum plates that will cover each of the stages. We will wash them with an unknown volume of media that will send for PCR. This is the high volume Cascade Impactor. Instead of plates, of aluminum plate, it has filters. So each stage is covered with a filter. These filters were processed, and virus was eluted and extracted. And that was the sample that we will send for quantitative PCR. Some pictures of the farms that we went to. These are turkey facilities. These are samplings inside from layers, turkeys, and growers. And this is the high volume type of air sampler. I want to show with this little circle that the Andersen Cascade Impactor is quite small. It works with a pump, but a pretty reliable air sampler. So just to show sizes of the different air samplers. These are the air samplers from the outside. This is our point of sampling that we call it 5 meters, so immediately outside the exhaust fan. Here, the only fan that was running was that one, so we calculate that it was more or less between 70 and 150 meters. And these are our air cyclonic collectors. These are layer flocks, quite a bit bigger, these facilities. A lot of huge facilities with big exhaust fans working, and here is very early in the morning collecting air samples. These layer facilities, they had many features and surfaces where we can hang our collectors. So this is the air cyclonic collector just right after the exhaust fans. And here many silos and many places where we were able to work. Here the Andersen Cascade Impactor that they sample for an hour because the airflow is very small, very low. This is from the inside. This is what we saw when we got there. So here are layers, and the disease was diagnosed in this farm, and they are producing eggs. So they were going to stop all this production, but just the day before we were able to take samples from the inside. So we also investigate particle deposition surrounding these farms. So we took environmental samples from surfaces in locations that were at high risk of direct exposure from the air that was being exhausted from the farm, and we did that only in layer flocks. With that, how we did that? So we had disposable gloves for each of the samples, and we dip into sterile media, sterile gauzes. We will swap a known area of 20 by 20. We will swap it and then extract that content into the media again and send that for and do the PCR analysis from that media. We sample farm fixtures like silos, walls, fans, door handles that were at risk to be in contact with workers, and we also a direct exposure of the exhaust fan of the farm, and we also swab temporary fomites. So boxes that we brought for the sampling that we knew that were clean when we got there, and they were only exposed for maximum of 2 hours. We also swabbed those surfaces to see what was the exposure, what was the amount of viruses that we were being exposed at. For the diagnostic testing, we did PCR at the University of Minnesota, and then we pursued the virus isolation of all these samples. If we go to see the results, these are the results for all the sampling events. So 5 out of 6 farms had at least one positive air sample. Here we have the results by species, all the turkeys, all the layer farms, and then the total. So 33% of all our air samples events were positive. 26 of them, we put them in the range of suspect, And then in total, we collect 138 air samples. 138, but we did many more PCRs because one of my samplers was 8 stages. So in order to calculate that, we add all the stages together, but we also did by particle size, so we have many more data by particle size. When we look at the results by distance, here we have by turkeys and layers, and then the results that we did from the inside, we were able to detect 60% of our samples were positive inside of the facilities. 45% we were able, very similar, the inside from immediately outside of the exhaust fan, and that was expected. But then we were able to detect, we had one positive of 70 to 150 meters. We were successful at detecting quite a bit of quantity of virus at that distance. And then the rest of the samples were suspect at 500 and or 1,000 meters. We only got 20% of our samples suspect. None of them were positive, but we detect low quantity of virus up to between 100 and 1 kilometer. So when we analyze particle size distribution of this virus in the air, first of all, here we have concentration of virus. So RNA copies of the virus in logs by cubic meter of first sample. And here we have particle size. So what we see is that we observed that highly pathogenic avian influenza was associated to all the particles. We saw virus in the very small particles, lower than 0.01. And then associated to the rest of the particles that we study, we saw more virus associated to larger particles. And this is layer facilities. This is inside compared to outside 5 meters. And we saw practically no difference between that, only maybe the smallest particles. We saw more smaller particles inside than outside. When we did that study in turkeys, we saw a little bit more of variability. These are two farms, Farm 1 and Farm 2, and these are the distribution of Farm 1, very similar to what we saw in layers, and then Farm 2, a little bit less amount of viruses and more variability between replicates within the same farm. So that was also interesting to see. This is the summary of results for the environmental sampling. We only did 2 farms, but we had interesting results. One of the first, the layer number 1, the farm was already in the process of being depopulated. We didn't find a lot of virus, no positive results, and only 45% of our samples were suspect. But when we went to the layer 2, this other facility, most of our samples came back positive. And that was a big surprise for us. We found a lot of virus and large quantities of it. And specifically, it was very impressive to see a lot of virus in our devices, in our boxes, in material that we knew for sure that it was negative when we got there. And after less than 2 hours of sampling, then we saw that it was quite positive. So a lot of contamination. These are the results for the virus isolation. 38% of our samples were virus isolation positive, of those samples collected inside. 52% of those collected immediately outside, and we were able to isolate a live virus in just that one sample that came back positive between 70 and 150 meters. So we were able to detect live virus at that distance. So when we saw those results, within particle size, we were able to detect live viruses in those particles larger than 2.1 microns. We were very excited about these results because it correlates to our experience that we had with birds and swine influenza. We had similar results. We were able to detect live virus in particles larger than 2.1. So this avian influenza correlates perfectly with our previous results. So, as a conclusion, high pathogenic avian influenza can be aerosolized from infected flocks and remain airborne. High pathogenic avian influenza RNA was detected in most of the air samples inside and immediately outside of the infected premises, but we were able to detect low quantity of genetic materials up to 1 kilometer. Viable virus was detected up to 70 meters, between 70 and 100 meters from the farm, and it was detected in particles larger than 2.1 microns, up to 10 microns. Those are the ones that we measure. So we observed a considerable, an important environmental contamination when we got there. And it was demonstrated across multiple surfaces that we sampled, not only the silos that they were always there, or the fixtures of the farm. It was always also in our material. This virus was associated to all the particle size ranges that we measure. And we believe that both the transport of airborne particles and the deposition of these airborne particles onto surfaces around all these infected premises, we believe that that's an important risk for the spread of high pathogenic avian influenza to other locations. And with that, I would like to acknowledge people that make this study possible, Brian McCloskey from the USDA and Mia Torquety, and then collaborators from the University of Minnesota, Debbie Patnayak and Robert Porner for the BDL, and university swine graduate students and public health residents that helped me with the sampling, and of course the poultry industry veterinarians and the producers that help us with those farms and locating them and identifying them. So thank you. With that, I appreciate it.